On the morning of February 4th, 1991, a taxicab driver named Wang was chatting with the taxi dispatcher at headquarters when suddenly, for no clear reason, the dispatcher stopped talking to Wang and just began staring intently at something behind Wang. And so Wang noticed this, and right away he turned around to see what it was he was looking at. But all Wang could see was just a window that looked out to this huge fenced-in parking lot that was full of taxi cabs and their drivers. This is where they would go to wait for fares. And where the taxi headquarters were located was right near the airport in a very busy city called Kaohsiung City in Taiwan. And so taxi cabs in this area were really in high demand. And so as Wang looked out at the very busy parking lot full of drivers talking to potential customers, to Wang, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was just a typical busy day. But when Wang kind of looked at the dispatcher like, I don't really see what you see, the dispatcher just raised his finger and kind of pointed in the direction that he was staring. And so Wang turned around again, and this time when he looked in the direction the dispatcher was pointing, he could see immediately why the dispatcher was reacting the way he was. Because the dispatcher was pointing at one of their colleagues, so another taxi driver, whose name was Leo Shui Chung, and as Wang looked out at him, he saw Leo was sprinting across this very busy parking lot full of all these cabs and drivers and customers, and Leo was clutching this big golden statue of Buddha in his arms as he ran. And so Wang and the dispatcher watched Leo, and what he did is he kept running all the way across the lot until he got to his taxi cab, at which point he practically dove inside of it. He slammed the door, locked every door, and then began looking around frantically like he was expecting someone to show up who had been like chasing him or something. But there was nobody around his car, and Wang and the dispatcher kind of scanned the parking lot, and they didn't see anybody who seemed remotely interested in Leo. And so Wang and the dispatcher continued to watch Leo from the window, and they saw eventually Leo stopped kind of scanning around for other people, and at that point he took that golden statue of Buddha and he placed it up on the dash of his cab. And this was not the first Buddha statue that he had put up there. From Wang and the dispatcher's perspective, it looked like he had at least 2 or 3 that were right up there alongside this new one. And then after Leo placed this new golden statue, he sort of sat back in his chair, and from Wang and the dispatcher's perspective, it sort of looked like he had closed his eyes and was praying or mumbling something, but whatever he was doing, it just seemed kind of odd. And so eventually Wang and the dispatcher stopped watching Leo, who still just continued to sit back in his chair and mumble or pray or something. And then Wang and the dispatcher looked at each other and they exchanged very concerned looks, because they both knew Leo was kind of a weird guy, but from his behavior today, it just seemed like something must be wrong with Leo. There has to be some issue. So for context, Leo was this 35-year-old guy who lived alone, and he had this reputation of being very antisocial and kind of just rude. Like, he had terrible manners. But recently, Wang and the dispatcher and other taxi drivers who worked at this company had noticed that Leo's behavior had gone from being kind of awkward and antisocial to being kind of menacing, like not even including the weird behavior he was exhibiting now, just like in his day-to-day interactions with people. He was just really aggressive. Like, he always would tell his colleagues at the taxi company how much he hated stray cats and dogs. And, a lot of people found these stray cats and dogs in their neighborhood in the city to be a bit of a nuisance. They'd rummage through trash and make noise or whatever, but nobody really paid them much attention. They were just stray animals trying to survive. Like, it wasn't a big deal. But for Leo, he obsessed over hating the stray cats and dogs and how much he wanted them to get out of his neighborhood. And somewhat recently, he had come to work and told his colleagues that he had gone out and gotten a crossbow, and at night he'd begun shooting at the stray cats and dogs, which totally horrified his colleagues. And now Leo had this weird thing going on with his Buddha statues that he was putting inside of his cab. And also, in addition to those statues, he had begun putting on the windows inside of his cab these things called fulus, which are these little strips of yellow parchment paper that basically ward off evil spirits. And so Leo had basically transformed the interior of his cab into this sort of weird shrine or temple. And in fact, Leo had put up so many of these fulus on the inside of the windows, and again, all those statues that sat on the dash, that when he drove, he could barely see because his view was totally obstructed. But despite everybody at the company seeing this totally weird behavior playing out with Leo, nobody went up to him and said, hey, what are you doing with these statues and pieces of paper? Like, what's going on here? Because nobody wanted to interact with him. He seemed like kind of a menace, and so people just kind of let him do his thing. But now, as Wang and the dispatcher are watching Leo like run across the lot and act totally psychotic, they looked at each other and they were like, maybe we should do something. And so Wang volunteered to call the police, and as Wang turned to go walk out and make the call, he saw Leo peeling out of the parking lot, nearly smashing into cars and people, just driving like a total maniac. And so Leo really felt like, okay, yeah, this really is the time to step in. Someone's gonna get hurt here. The following day, Wang would contact his friend in the police department, and he would explain what was going on with Leo. And to Wang's surprise, his friend told him that actually the police were well aware of Leo. And that was because not all that long ago, Leo was actually a suspect in a murder case. So about 10 months earlier, in April of 1990, a 23-year-old woman from Japan named Mariko Iguchi had visited Taiwan on vacation, and during this vacation, she had gone missing. Now, at the time, the Taiwanese economy really relied heavily on Japanese tourism, and so Taiwan really aggressively marketed to Japan to, come visit, come on vacation here. And so it was pretty common for Japanese college students to visit Taiwan on vacation to celebrate things like a graduation or a birthday party. And so that's what Mariko was doing. She was here celebrating, and she was traveling alone. Also, one sort of quirky thing about Taiwanese culture at the time was it was pretty common for taxi cab drivers to open up their own personal homes to their fares, basically saying, hey, don't stay at a hotel, I'll give you a ride wherever you're gonna go, but then at night you can stay at my house with my family. And so it was just kind of a thing in Taiwan that people visited and stayed at the homes of their taxi cab drivers. So when Mariko came to Taiwan on this vacation, this is what she did. She stayed in the home of the taxi cab driver, and it was during this period of time that she went missing. And so naturally, when the investigation began into her disappearance, the first place police went were the taxi cab drivers. And so first, the police focused on a driver in the capital of Taiwan who said he had given Mariko a few rides, he had brought her sightseeing, and then he had let her stay in his home. But he said, after that, she left and he didn't see her again. He had no idea what happened to her. And the police would actually discover that after Mariko left that particular driver's house, she would send a postcard to her family that was dated after she had left. And so basically this ruled out the first driver as a suspect. And so for a little while, this case went cold because the police couldn't find any other taxi cab drivers that had given Mariko a ride. But then, a few months later, the police offered a reward for information about what happened to Mariko, and it was then that police got a tip that Mariko had been seen speaking to Leo at the train station before she disappeared. But when police spoke to Leo, he immediately said, yes, I did give Mariko a ride, but that was it. She didn't stay at my house. It was just this one ride from the train station into town, and after she got out, I have no idea what happened to her. And so police would ask Leo dozens more questions and they would try to get more information from him, but he just didn't have any. And then at the same time, there was this flood of all these new tips that began coming into the police station about this case. But it would turn out a lot of these leads, like all of them, were just terrible tips. People were calling in totally random stuff just because now there was this monetary reward for information, and it was kind of incentivizing people to just call in anything. And it was actually making the investigation much harder because now the police had all these bad tips, and so they really weren't getting anywhere. But despite the slow progress the police were making in this case had really been elevated and become like a huge international news story, and lots of people all over the world were following it. And during this time, when all these people are tuned in to this case, really weird things began happening surrounding this case. People in the city began receiving all these strange phone calls from this kind of frantic woman speaking Japanese. And in Taiwan, people predominantly speak Taiwanese and Mandarin, not Japanese. So this is a weird phone call to be getting in Taiwan. And also at this time, you need to remember that Mariko's disappearance was kind of all over the news. And so to get these weird calls from a woman speaking Japanese who sounds totally frantic, it made people in the city believe that it was Mariko placing these strange phone calls. But these calls, they didn't make any sense. It was just a woman kind of yelling in Japanese, and then she would just abruptly hang up. And also there were all these reports of people claiming to have seen Mariko or heard Mariko just in the city walking around. None of it was substantiated, but there was just kind of this eerie quality to the case. And so when Wang called his friend at the police department to report Leo for his totally weird behavior, This was at a time when the Mariko missing person case was still totally front of mind in Taiwan and around the world, and also the police were still actively investigating this case, and frankly, Leo had not been ruled out as a suspect in this case. He was not considered a primary suspect by any means, but he wasn't ruled out yet, and so the police are hearing that Leo's acting really funny, and it made them think, hey, maybe we should reinvestigate this guy and see if he really is connected to the Mariko missing person case. And so ultimately, after Wang hung up, his friend in the police department got in touch with the lead detective on the Mariko case and told him about what was going on with Leo. And this lead detective, whose name was Lin Xiaoji, decided he would just put Leo under surveillance to see what he was doing. So, starting sometime in the middle of February of 1991, Detective Lin and a few of his colleagues began taking turns trailing Leo basically 24/7. And so the police just kept their distance and they followed Leo all around the city as he picked up his fares. And, the police never got out to talk to any of the fares, to get insights into whatever Leo might have been saying inside the cab. They just kind of watched from a distance and just wanted to see if there was any obvious red flags. Detective Lin figured, if Leo was somehow involved in whatever happened to Mariko, let's say she was killed, and let's say Leo was responsible for killing her, maybe if they followed Leo long enough, he might drive to an area that was kind of connected to her murder, maybe her gravesite or the place where he killed her or something. Going to kind of strange random locations without a fare would likely be an indication to police that that was a place of interest. But as the police tailed Leo, that's not what he did. Leo basically never ever left his cab. Leo basically just picked up a passenger, drove them where they needed to go, and then repeated over and over and over again all day long. And then at the end of the night, instead of going home to his apartment that police knew he had, he would just sleep inside of his cab, just like in parking lots and stuff. And the only times he would go into his apartment appeared to be just so he could go to the bathroom or maybe shower or something, because they would see him through the window. But whenever Leo went into his apartment, he went through the same totally weird ritual every time. He would be in his cab, parked out front of his apartment, and the police are, parked far enough away that they can watch this. And Leo, at some point, would begin kind of frantically looking all around him, as if he was looking for somebody who was trying to hurt him or who was spying on him or something. And then after kind of making sure the coast was clear, Leo would open up his door and sprint, like absolutely as fast as he could, into his apartment building, and he'd only be in there for like a couple of minutes before he'd come bombing back out and practically dive into his cab, and he would shut all the doors, lock all the doors, and then, he'd clutch his golden statues and he'd rub his fulus that were taped all over the inside of his cab, and he'd continue frantically looking around, to make sure nobody was there to hurt him or something. And then after a little while, he'd kind of calm down, he'd put his statue back on the dash, he'd kind of make sure his fulus were all in place, and then he would drive away. So, of course, Leo's behavior, from the police's perspective, was totally bizarre, but in Detective Lin's mind, it didn't really seem like the behavior of a murderer. It seemed more like the behavior of someone who had lost their mind. Finally, on March 4th, 1991, Detective Lin decided that he just needed to speak to Leo, which required, basically ambushing Leo. So Detective Lin coordinated with his officers who were out surveilling Leo, and he had them tell him when Leo was at his apartment, going in to use the bathroom. And when they called in to Detective Lin that, hey, he just got to his apartment, he's about to run inside, Detective Lin and some other officers raced to the apartment, and they were all ready outside for whenever Leo came running back out to dive back into his cab. They were going to intercept him. And now Detective Lin and his colleagues didn't really know how Leo was going to react to having all these police standing there ready to grab him. I mean, was this guy going to be hostile? Was he going to be aggressive? Was he going to be scared, sad? They had no idea. It just seemed like Leo was totally unstable, so they all kind of had to be ready for whatever reaction he was going to have. However, the way Leo ultimately reacted to this was not the way any of the officers suspected. When Leo came bombing out of his apartment after a very short bathroom break, he began charging down the stairs towards his cab, and then seemed to kind of realize there were all these detectives and police officers all standing in front of him, literally getting ready to grab him, and Leo just collapsed to his knees and began sobbing and thanking them over and over and over again. Now, Detective Lin had no idea what this was. He didn't really understand what Liao was thanking them for, but he didn't waste any time trying to figure out what was going on. Instead, Detective Lin just went up to Liao and said, "Hey, we need to speak to you at the station. Will you come with us?" And Liao was like, "Of course I will. Of course I will." And so Detective Lin drove Liao to the police station, and when they got there, Liao was saying things like, "Oh, I wish I could just stay at the police station with you all. Like, this is where I'm safe. I want to stay here." Now, Lin didn't really respond to this. He just kind of said, "Okay, yeah." And then they went inside together to head towards the interview room, and as they're walking there, Liao is saying over and over again to Detective Lin and any of the officers he passes by, "Thank you so much. You're my savior. Thank you." Now, the police had no idea why Liao was treating them like his saviors, because to them, they're like, "Dude, we just ambushed you and brought you to the police station to question you about potentially being involved in a murder, so I don't know how we saved you." But it would turn out Liao had a really compelling reason to believe they really had just saved him. Because it would turn out Liao had this absolutely terrifying thing happening inside of his apartment. Just several minutes earlier, when Liao had run into his apartment, so right before he charged back outside and police grabbed him and took him to the station, when he was still inside of his apartment, he stepped inside and the apartment was totally dark. All the lights are off, all the shades are drawn, and immediately Liao felt his heart starting to race. And he looked around his apartment and it was totally silent, but then he heard it. He could hear on the far side of his apartment, in a room that he couldn't quite see into, the sound of breathing. But Liao lives alone. There shouldn't be anybody here. He has no pets, there's nobody here, but he hears breathing in another room. But Liao knew there was nothing he could do. The only thing he could do was just try to get in there, go to the bathroom, and get out as quickly as possible. And so very slowly, Liao began kind of tiptoeing across the living room floor, kind of making sure to stay out of eyesight of the doorway that led into the room where the breathing was coming from. And as soon as he kind of got past an area where he could be seen from the doorway, he ran the rest of the way down the hallway. He cut into the bathroom and shut the door and locked it. And then, as quickly as he could, he did his business. He used a washcloth to clean himself because he didn't have time to take a shower because of what was going on inside of his apartment. And then once he was all done, he took a deep breath and then he opened up the door. And this time, the apartment was absolutely silent. There was no more breathing. And so Liao, thinking he had this opportunity to get out of here without being caught by this thing inside of his apartment, he turned and just started running towards the door. And as soon as he did, he began to hear a voice, a hoarse female voice, screaming at him from the other side of his apartment, screeching, "Why? Why? Why?" And as Liao is just about to get to the door, he turns and he sees Mariko, the missing woman, running with her hair all knotted and matted hanging over her face, sprinting towards him from that back room. And Liao, he only managed to barely get out of his apartment and shut it and lock it before she ran into the door. And then it went silent again. This is why Liao was acting totally crazy, because he was terrified of what he believed was like this demonic entity inside of his apartment. He didn't think that was a real person. He thought it was like the spirit of Mariko or something, and she was haunting him. And so he had no idea what to do. He didn't know who to tell, and he just began living out of his cab instead of dealing with whatever was going on in his apartment. And so when Liao charged outside after this latest encounter with Mariko, he sees the police, and Liao is just overwhelmed with relief. Hopefully, he's thinking they can get rid of her and his life can go back to normal. But as overjoyed as Liao appeared to be, and now having the police on his side, finally being able to deal with whatever was going on, when push came to shove, Liao actually did not feel comfortable immediately giving up details of whatever was going on with Mariko inside of his apartment. But as Liao was brought by Detective Lin to the police station to tell them what was going on with how Mariko was in his apartment and she was haunting him, it seemed like it was the ghost of her or something. As Liao was having that conversation, other police officers were sent to Liao's apartment to go see if maybe Mariko really was in his apartment. Maybe that's where she had been this whole time. time. Maybe she broke into this guy's apartment and was just squatting there and harassing him, and that was the mystery. That's where she's been. But when police went into Leao's apartment, there was no sign whatsoever that anybody else besides Leao was living in that apartment. There was no sign of a break-in. I mean, there was nothing. It was just Leao's apartment. And so this made police really suspicious of Leao because his story was so outrageous, and also he's talking about a person who's actively missing, Mariko. And so the police really pressured Leao to, come forward, give us more information. Why did you say this is Mariko in your apartment? Because there's nobody in your apartment. Tell us what's going on here. And so finally, after 4 days of intense questioning of Leao did finally admit to police that there was more to this story. It would turn out Leao really did pick Mariko up at the train station when she arrived in Taiwan for her vacation. So he did give her a ride, just like he said he had. But Leao had lied about what happened after that. It would turn out, after giving her this ride, Leao stayed with Mariko and they went sightseeing together, and then Leao invited Mariko to stay with him at his apartment, which again was customary in Taiwan. And so Mariko said yes, and she went to his apartment in the evening, and while they were there, Leao did proposition Mariko, and she rejected him. And at first, Leao just let it go, but then after Mariko fell asleep that night, he got his crossbow that he used to shoot dogs and cats, and he went into her room and he shot her 4 times with the crossbow and then cut her head off. Leao would bury her body the following night, but that same night was the first time Leao began hearing the breathing in his apartment. He couldn't quite place it, and then not long after that, the head of Mariko, the severed head, would chase him all around his apartment, screaming, why at him. And so basically, Mariko's severed head began haunting Leao incessantly to the point where he moved into his taxi cab and put up all those fulu papers to protect him from evil spirits, and also put up all those statues of Buddha for the same reason. I mean, he was living in his cab to protect himself from what he believed was this evil spirit. And so when people saw Leao in his cab kind of sitting back and muttering to himself, that was him praying that he would live through whatever was going on with this head. Leao would tell police where he buried Mariko's body, and he would tell police he buried her entire body in one location, including her head. But when police dug her up, it was only her lower half. Her head was missing. Leao was convicted of murder, and to this day, he is still in prison. Many people in Taiwan believe that, this case was ultimately solved because of Mariko's spirit, that she played a big role. Her head haunting Leao is what drove him crazy to the point where he admitted to police what he did. And then also, people in Taiwan think all those strange phone calls they were getting from that woman who was speaking Japanese and acting frantic and then hanging up, they say that was Mariko's spirit too, that was maybe one of her attempts just to keep people engaged with the story so that it wouldn't fade and become a cold case. And in fact, even some of the police, including Detective Lin, say they do believe Mariko's spirit played a role. And in fact, Detective Lin said at one point when he was inside of Leao's apartment, he was by himself and he felt someone push him on the back. And when he turned around, there was nobody there. And so he was convinced that Mariko's spirit was inhabiting that apartment. On Friday, January 10th, 2003, 85-year-old Anna Mae Branson was standing in her bedroom closet on the second floor of her large home in Madisonville, Kentucky. Madisonville was a peaceful coal mining town that residents had nicknamed the best town on earth. Anna Mae was trying to pick out the perfect outfit to wear to a dance that she was going to the following night with her new fiancé. And she eyed a long black cape with a leopard print collar hanging in the closet, and she smiled. Anna Mae loved clothes, and at 85 years old, she still enjoyed getting all dressed up. So almost every time she left the house, she wore high heels, a huge sparkling diamond ring, and a perfectly styled wig. In fact, Anna Mae had built a reputation in town for dressing like a movie star for decades, and she wasn't about to give that up now just because some people saw her as an old lady. But Anna Mae had not always worn fancy clothes and expensive diamonds. She was born in Madisonville in 1917, the oldest of 5 siblings, and she had a pretty traditional upbringing that involved going to church regularly and helping her parents look after her younger siblings. And most people in town had made their living from working in the Kentucky coal mines or from running farms. But as Anna Mae grew up, she had discovered she was great with numbers and with money. And so at a time when there weren't a lot of career opportunities for women, she had dreamed of starting her own business someday. So after she had graduated high school and gotten married, she and her husband worked several different jobs and put away as much money as they could for the future. And then in 1950, when they'd saved up enough, they bought a Dairy Queen franchise and then opened the first fast food restaurant in Madisonville. And it turned out Madisonville loved Dairy Queen. And soon, Anna Mae and her husband's restaurant was the busiest place in town, and they were bringing in more money than they had ever imagined. Anna Mae and her husband had run the Dairy Queen successfully for 40 years, and over that long period of time, they had become two of the most well-known and beloved people in all of Madisonville. But then, in 1994, Anna Mae's husband passed away, and she didn't want to run the restaurant without him, so she had sold the Dairy Queen and walked away a millionaire. At the time, most of her family had assumed Anna Mae would retire, but she loved working and feeling like she was part of the community, so she had taken a chunk of the money she'd made from selling the Dairy Queen and invested it in rental homes and other real estate properties in the area. And so by now, she had been running her own real estate business for almost 10 years and had made a ton more money in the process. And she had no intention of retiring anytime soon. Back in the closet, Anna Mae walked over to the shelves that held her large shoe collection. But before she could decide which pair of high heels she should wear to the following night's dance, she heard the phone ring in the bedroom. So she stepped out of the closet, walked across her room, and grabbed the phone on the bedside table. And right away, as she listened to the voice on the other line, a very concerned look came across her face. There was a man yelling at her on the other line, and Anna Mae could not figure out what he was even saying. She asked the man to calm down and to please speak lower, but the man shouted that Anna Mae needed to come to his house as soon as she could. And Anna Mae finally recognized the voice. It was Robert Prince, a man who rented a house from her. So she asked Robert, what's wrong? What's going on here? How can I help? Then Robert got really quiet, and in almost a whisper, he said there were ghosts in his attic, and that Anna Mae had to come get the ghosts out of there. Then Robert hung up on the other line, and Anna Mae stood there in her bedroom with a stunned look on her face. She hung up the phone and sat down on her bed. Robert had always been a little weird and eccentric since he'd moved in to one of her properties, but saying he saw ghosts in the attic was strange, even for him, and Anna Mae didn't know how to handle it. She worried if she called the police about this, Robert might get in some kind of trouble, and she didn't want that. So she decided she would call to check in on him over the weekend and then maybe pay him a visit on Monday if she needed to. Anna Mae took a deep breath and collected herself, but then a sudden knock at the front door startled her. And she laughed because she wondered if maybe one of her other renters was also coming to tell her that they had ghosts in their house too. So Anna Mae got up and headed downstairs, and when she opened the front door, a grin came across her face. Because it was not a renter scared of ghosts, it was her nephew, Russell Winstead. Russell smiled and gave his aunt a big hug. He was 37 years old, 6 foot 1 inches tall, and his brown hair was just starting to turn a little gray. Anna Mae's younger brothers and sisters all had children, so Anna Mae had a bunch of nieces and nephews, and all of those nieces and nephews said Anna Mae was like a second mom to them. And so, as Anna Mae had gotten older, the ones who still lived in Madisonville made it a point to stop by regularly to check on her, and to make sure she wasn't alone too often in her big house. Anna Mae and Russell walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. And right away, Russell asked her how the real estate business was going. And Anna Mae just laughed and then told him about how Robert Prince, one of her renters, had actually just called and said there were ghosts in his attic. And so that was basically how the real estate business was going. But while Anna Mae laughed, Russell didn't. He did not think it was funny at all. He said it sounded like the guy was seriously disturbed. And he told Anna Mae not to go over to the house to see Robert by herself. He said if she really needed to see him, she should call him, Russell, or his dad, who was Anna Mae's youngest brother, and they would go with her. Anna Mae thanked Russell, but told him that really everything was fine, Robert Prince was harmless, and then she quickly changed the subject and asked how things were going with him. Russell filled her in on what his wife and kids were up to, and said they'd all see her at church on Sunday night, and then he also talked a little bit about how his work as a mining engineer was going. And then, after they talked a little while longer, Russell said he better get home for dinner, so he stood up, gave his aunt another big hug, and walked out. Once Russell was gone, Anna Mae headed back upstairs into her closet to settle on an outfit for the big dance she was going to the next day. And then, later that night, as she got ready for bed, she thought again about that phone call from Robert, and suddenly it really wasn't funny to her. Much like Russell, she did think that, maybe something was wrong with Robert. Maybe he really was disturbed, and that she needed to be really careful with him and not be alone with him. But by the following night, Saturday night, Anna Mae had put Robert and the ghosts in his attic out of her mind because she was having the best time she'd had in months, dancing with her new fiancé in an outfit that made her look like a movie star. The next day, on Sunday, January 12th, so 2 days after Anna Mae got that call about ghosts from Robert Prince, she was attending evening services at the church that was right across the street from her house. And at around 7 p.m., the service ended, and Anna Mae went to the lobby to say hi to some of her friends. And as she was there, her nephew Russell, who had visited her a couple days earlier, along with his wife and their kids, came over to talk to her for a bit. A little while later, Anna Mae said goodnight to everyone, stepped outside, and walked across the street to her house. She was wearing a sweater, her diamond ring, and one of her capes. When she got home, Anna Mae walked through the living room and back to the kitchen. She took off her cape and draped it over a kitchen chair. Then she made herself some soup and sat down to eat. But at 7:15 p.m., a few minutes after she'd begun eating, there was a loud knock at the front door. Now, visitors often stopped by to see Anna Mae after church, so she didn't think anything out of the ordinary was going on. So she walked to the front of the house, she opened the door, smiled, and said hello to the visitor standing there. Then the visitor stepped inside, but Anna Mae didn't notice that they were hiding something behind their back. The visitor then took a deep breath and then told Anna Mae that they really needed her help big time. But after hearing what they wanted, Anna Mae shook her head and said she would not do what the visitor was asking her to do. And then suddenly the visitor's face turned red and they started shouting at Anna Mae. A look of fear crossed Anna Mae's face and she took a few steps back, but the visitor moved in closer to her, shouting even louder and showing her what they had hiding behind their back. It was a 2-foot, 1/2-inch metal breaker bar, which is like a large socket wrench used to tighten or loosen rusted bolts. The visitor held the breaker bar above their head, and Anna Mae screamed. She held up her hands and tried to get the visitor to calm down, but they just kept on shouting. So Anna Mae finally turned around and moved as fast as she could through the living room, and then she rushed down a long hallway to a door that led into the basement. Anna Mae reached out, and the doorknob rattled in her shaking hands, but she flung the door open, slammed it behind her, and started down the stairs into the basement away from this person. But when she reached the bottom, she heard the door to the basement open again, and she turned back, looked up the stairs, and saw standing there was this person, breaker bar in hand over their head, and a second later they were charging down the stairs after her. At around 11:30 a.m. on the following morning, Anna Mae's new fiancé stepped out of his car and walked up to the front door of Anna Mae's house. He was there to pick her up for a lunch date they had planned. Anna Mae's fiancé was a retired doctor in his late 80s, and he never thought he would get married again so late in life. But when he had met Anna Mae, he'd fallen in love with her right away, and so he decided he wanted to spend whatever time he had left with her, and he had proposed, and Anna Mae had said yes. The fiancé knocked on the door and waited, but Anna Mae didn't answer, so he knocked again, and then he rang the doorbell. But still, there was nothing. So he leaned in close to the door to try to hear if there was any movement inside, but the house was quiet. And when a couple more minutes had passed with still no Anna Mae, he really started to worry. So he walked away from the house and went across the street to the church. He walked into the church lobby and stepped into a small office where a woman was sitting behind a desk, and he said he was worried something was wrong with Anna Mae, and he asked the woman to call 911 and then to please call Anna Mae's brother, Earl. The woman knew Anna Mae and her family very well, and she said she would take care of it. The fiancé thanked her, and then quickly he rushed out of the church and walked back across the street to Anna Mae's house. And in a matter of minutes, an officer from the Madisonville Police Department and Anna Mae's brother, Earl, pulled up in front of the house. Earl and the officer stepped out of their cars and headed towards the front door. Earl was 67 years old, 18 years younger than his sister, and like his son Russell, he had made it a habit to check on Anna Mae whenever he could. Earl said hello to the officer and the fiancé, and then walked right to a small bush by the porch. He crouched down and grabbed the spare key he knew Anna Mae kept hidden under that bush. Then, with the key, he unlocked the door and let the officer and Anna Mae's fiancé inside. Once inside, all three men started calling out for Anna Mae, but they got no response, so they split up. The officer headed upstairs, the fiancé went to the kitchen, and Earl walked through the living room. They were all concerned Anna Mae had possibly fallen and maybe been knocked unconscious, and Earl was worried that the fall could have taken place sometime the night before, and so she might have been out cold or injured for a long time. Earl called out for his sister again, but he still didn't get a response. So he walked down the hall to the basement door. Then he opened the door, turned on the light, and walked down the stairs. But when he got halfway down the stairs and looked at the floor below him, he screamed. Earl shook his head and he hoped that what he was looking at was some kind of nightmare or hallucination, but it was real, and he couldn't believe it. Anna Mae's body was lying on a rug on the basement floor. She was covered in blood, and her sweater and the shirt she'd been wearing under it were torn to shreds. Earl didn't know what had happened, but he knew this was not the result of a fall. Earl rushed down the rest of the stairs and stood over his sister's broken body. Tears started running down his cheeks, and he felt like he'd gotten the wind knocked out of him. Anna Mae had been about 18 when Earl was born, and she had always been protective of her youngest brother. And even when Earl was an adult with children of his own, Anna Mae had always looked out for Earl's family and helped them in any way she could. In the basement, Earl heard footsteps on the stairs. He looked up and saw Anna Mae's fiancé and the police officer. And when the fiancé saw Anna Mae on the floor, he broke down in tears just like Earl. But the police officer just stood there in shock. It had been 20 years since the last major homicide case had happened in Madisonville, and that was a long time before he, and a lot of people on Madisonville's small police force, had started their careers in law enforcement. The officer quickly called into the police station for backup, and he contacted the county sheriff's department. But he was pretty sure that even the county officers had not seen anything like this before. A few minutes after the call went out to the police and the sheriff's departments, Officer Kelly Rager of the Madisonville Police parked her cruiser in front of Anna Mae's house. She stepped outside and right away felt a chill run through her body. Winter temperatures had dropped below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but it wasn't the weather Rager was feeling. She was shaken because she knew the woman who had lived in this large two-story house. Officer Rager's mom and Anna Mae had been friends for years, and like so many people in Madisonville, Rager had looked up to Anna Mae, and she thought Anna Mae was an inspiration to people, and especially to women who wanted to pursue a career that some others thought women had no business doing. Officer Rager walked towards the front door and heard a car screech to a stop behind her. She turned around and saw Detective Scott Troutman from the Hopkins County Sheriff's Department step out of his car and walk towards her. The two young investigators greeted each other and talked briefly. They both knew they were coming to the scene of a homicide. And even though Troutman did not have a personal connection to the victim like Rager did, he knew how well loved Anna Mae and her family were throughout the area. So Troutman understood that this case was going to affect the entire community. The investigators walked into the house together and saw Earl and Anna Mae's fiancé sitting in the living room with the first officer who had arrived on the scene. All three of them looked like they were still in shock. Detective Troutman crossed over to Earl and the fiancé and told them how sorry he was, and then he asked if they wouldn't mind walking him through what had happened earlier that morning. And they both gave him an account of how they'd gotten to the house and how they'd found Anna Mae's body in the basement. Troutman thanked them for their time and told them investigators would follow up with them soon. Then he and Rager headed to the basement. Anna Mae had converted the basement almost into a small apartment. There was a living room with a comfortable couch, a bathroom with a shower in it, a washer and a dryer, and a small refrigerator and freezer. And when the investigators stepped into that basement, they saw Anna Mae lying face down on a rug in front of the couch. But something immediately stood out to both of them. There was a pool of blood around Anna Mae's body, but other than that, the basement looked totally clean. There was no blood spatter on the walls, the floor, or the stairs. The investigators knew they would have to do a thorough search of the basement, but at first glance, it looked like whoever had killed Anna Mae had taken the time to wipe down the entire crime scene. Detective Troutman did a walkthrough of the basement while Officer Rager crouched down on the floor next to Anna Mae's body to look more closely at the wounds. It was hard for her to concentrate because she couldn't understand how any human being could do something like this to a defenseless 85-year-old woman. But she took a deep breath and tried to leave her personal feelings aside and focused on finding evidence. And one of the first things she noticed was that Anna Mae was still wearing her large, expensive diamond ring. To Rager, this all but ruled out the murder being the result of a robbery. because why would a robber leave behind such an obvious, expensive piece of jewelry? Then Troutman called Rager over to him. He was down on one knee, leaning in close to the small freezer that was pushed up against one of the walls. So Rager stood up and walked away from the body. Then she crouched down too, next to Troutman, and he pointed out 2 streaks of blood on the freezer, the only blood he'd found in the basement other than the blood right around Anna Mae. And Troutman told Rager that he thought there was something interesting about these streaks of blood. The streaks looked entirely different from each other. Troutman was not a blood spatter expert, but his first thought was that the 2 patterns had been made by 2 different weapons. And the idea that the killer took the time to use 2 separate weapons made him think they must have really wanted to inflict as much pain as possible, or that they had had a mental break and had gone into some kind of frenzied attack. And then, not long after the discovery of these unique blood streaks on the freezer, forensics experts from the county arrived, and they confirmed Troutman's hunch. They said 2 weapons had been used in the attack on Anna Mae. And they also confirmed that someone had cleaned the crime scene, but must have just missed the marks on the freezer. And so while the forensics team did a thorough investigation of the basement and the body, Troutman and Rager went outside and interviewed neighbors to find out if anybody had seen anything out of the ordinary that morning or the night before. But the only information they got was that one neighbor thought she might have seen a truck parked in front of Anna Mae's house on Sunday night, but she couldn't remember the make and model of the truck, so by the time the investigators left the scene later that day, they really did not have much to go on. They considered the possibility that Anna Mae's fiancé might have committed the murder because the violence of the attack could indicate a crime of passion. But her fiancé was an old man who was not in the best health, and they had a hard time believing he had the strength to carry out the kind of attack that had taken place in the basement. So they knew they had to start looking for other potential suspects. So later that evening, several hours after the 911 call, investigators met with different members of Anna Mae's family, and several family members said they knew who police needed to talk to. Robert Prince, the man who rented a house from Anna Mae and recently claimed there were ghosts in his attic that Anna Mae was responsible for. With information about Robert Prince coming from Anna Mae's family, investigators focused their attention on him. And as they dug into his past, he quickly became their primary suspect. Police discovered that multiple people had filed assault charges against Robert, and some people who knew him said he had violent tendencies. It also turned out that Robert drove a truck that could fit the description of the truck Anna Mae's neighbor had claimed to have seen outside of her house on the night of the murder. And then investigators got a piece of bizarre news that made Robert look even more guilty. One of Anna Mae's nieces told police that on the afternoon of January 12th, just a few hours before Anna Mae was believed to have been murdered, Robert Prince had come to the niece's house. And when she had opened the door, he was holding a DVD player, and he said he had to sell the DVD player because he needed some fast cash so he could get out of town. The niece was not interested in buying this DVD player, and so she had sent Robert away, and she hadn't really thought much about it. But when she learned he was a suspect in her aunt's murder case, she wished she had said something to the police right after Robert had showed up at her door. So at this point, investigators believed they had more than enough to bring Robert in for questioning and to get a search warrant for his house. Now, the initial search of Robert's house did not turn up any evidence linking him to the murder, but investigators still saw him as their primary suspect. And so a couple of days after the murder, Robert arrived at the police station for questioning. And from the moment he walked inside, he was on edge. He talked almost nonstop as he followed an officer into a small interrogation room where Detective Troutman was waiting. In the interrogation room, Robert sat down at a wooden table across from Troutman, and right away, Robert's eyes began darting left and right, left and right. Robert had long brown hair and a large, thick beard. But what stood out to Troutman immediately was that Robert's right arm was in a sling. Troutman sat quietly for a minute and watched Robert shifting in his chair and looking over his shoulder. Then Troutman asked Robert if he was right or left-handed, and Robert said he was right-handed. Troutman did not let his face give anything away, but he wondered if maybe Robert had injured his right arm while attacking Anna Mae, and that was why it was in a sling. Then Troutman leaned in and asked Robert about his past assault charges, but Robert got really angry and said he would not talk about any of them. So, in a calm voice, Troutman said that was fine, and he did his best to get Robert to relax. and then he asked Robert to talk about where he had been on the day Anna Mae had been killed. Robert shifted some more in his chair and then started tapping his left hand on the table. Troutman just kept looking at him, patiently waiting for him to respond. And finally, Robert did. He said he had been traveling to Tennessee that day, so he'd been out of the state. Troutman nodded and then asked if Robert had any proof of this trip. Robert tapped on the table even louder and looked around the room some more. Then he faced Troutman and he said he'd stopped at a convenience store in a small town in Tennessee and that someone from that store might remember him. Troutman knew Robert was acting very strange and suspicious, but the detective was not ready to totally condemn the man just because of odd behavior in an interrogation room, a place where lots of people, guilty and innocent, can act very strange. Troutman knew it would take some time, but he was confident he could track down that convenience store Robert had mentioned in Tennessee and find out if anyone had seen Robert there on the day of Anna Mae's murder. And so, for the time, police would keep Robert at the top of their suspect list, but they didn't have enough evidence to actually hold him. So they told him not to leave town, but he was allowed to go. And over the next few days, while they looked into Robert's alibi, investigators tried to expand their suspect list. But even though the investigation was really just getting started, Anna Mae's family was already worried that law enforcement was not moving fast enough. On Friday, January 17th, 4 days after Anna Mae's body had been discovered, friends and family attended Anna Mae's wake, and the wake gave them all a chance to share stories about how much Anna Mae had meant to all of them. And after the wake, Anna Mae's brothers and sisters and their kids went to Earl's house. They sat together in the living room and talked about some of their favorite memories of Anna Mae. None of them could believe what had happened. And even though she had been 85 years old, they talked about how they'd always thought she would just live forever. And she had been so full of life and energy that they couldn't imagine what their family and what the town would be like without her. But as much as they wanted to focus on Anna Mae's life, they couldn't help but start to talk about the murder investigation. Many of them believed Robert Prince was the most logical suspect. But talking about Robert led to a discussion of all the other people who rented homes and properties from Anna Mae, and they started to wonder if the killer could just be anyone who might have gotten behind on rental payments. And if the list of suspects really was that long, the family worried that the local police and sheriff's department were not up to the task in front of them. And over the course of the week, no new information came in, and police still didn't have any evidence that would actually link Robert to the murder. So Anna Mae's family started to fear that maybe they had been right about the police, and they hated the idea that Anna Mae's killer was still walking free. And so some members of Anna Mae's family started to voice their opinions publicly, and soon the rest of the town joined them in putting pressure on investigators to solve this case. After all, a place that called itself the best town on earth, like Madisonville, couldn't have the brutal murder of one of its most prominent citizens just hanging over it. And things only got worse for investigators when wild rumors started to spread that there was a serial killer roaming the streets of Madisonville and that anyone could be their next victim and anyone could be the killer. Detective Troutman, Officer Rager, and the rest of the investigative team felt the tension growing in town. They'd only been working the case for about a week, but they were already getting loads of calls from residents day in and day out. Some of the calls were from people who thought they might have information that could help. But a lot of the other calls were just people demanding to know what police were doing to solve the murder and to make their town safe again. And so, as they tried to push the investigation forward and keep the town residents calm, Detective Troutman and Officer Rager both began to have a thought that they couldn't shake. They believed the extreme violence of this crime suggested the attack on Anna Mae had to have been personal. And they were almost certain that there had to be some piece of evidence connecting Anna Mae to her killer somewhere in her house. They just needed to find it. In late January, so over a week after the murder, Officer Rager returned to Anna Mae's house. The investigative team and forensics experts had searched the entire house and had combed the basement for evidence multiple times, but Rager believed there was a chance they had overlooked something in the large house. So she stepped inside, walked through the living room, and headed upstairs. And even though the house was still filled with all of Anna Mae's belongings, it felt cold and empty. On the second floor of the house, she walked down a hall towards Anna Mae's bedroom, and as she moved, the hardwood floors creaked under her feet. Then she stepped into the bedroom and went into the closet. She smiled when she saw all of Anna Mae's eccentric and luxurious clothes and shoes, but nothing else inside the closet stood out to her, so she stepped back into the bedroom and walked over to a small wooden desk in the corner. The desk had stationery, pens, and a few papers on it, but nothing that looked like it could help. Then Rager opened a desk drawer, and it was filled with loose papers and a book that looked like a journal. She pulled out the book, flipped it open, and immediately a look came across her face like she had just discovered buried treasure. This journal was a business ledger, and inside it, Anna Mae had kept detailed records of everyone who owed her money, from how much they owed and how much they had paid towards their debt. Rager knew something like this could change the course of the investigation, so she slipped the ledger into an evidence bag and then headed back downstairs and out to her car. And soon after, she met up with Detective Troutman and the rest of the investigative team, and they looked at this ledger, and they were all stunned by how many people had owed Anna Mae money. But as they looked further into the ledger, they would discover something that would bring the investigation into focus, and that discovery would soon make it clear to them who had killed Anna Mae. Based on information inside of that ledger, evidence at the crime scene, and interviews conducted during the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Anna Mae Branson in her home on Sunday, January 12, 2003. At about 7:15 p.m., Anna Mae's killer parked their pickup truck in Anna Mae's driveway, and then they sat there for a minute with the engine running. They stared out the windshield at the front door of the house and tried to tell themselves they were just there to get help, and that if Anna Mae agreed to help them, nothing bad would happen. The killer turned off the engine, reached over to the passenger seat floorboard, and grabbed the 2-foot metal braking bar that was propped up against the seat. Then they got out of the truck, hid the braking bar behind their back, and stepped onto the raised porch in front of the house. Then the killer glanced down at a large bone-handled knife tucked into a sheath on their belt. Then they took a breath and knocked on the door. Soon after, the door opened and the killer saw Anna Mae smiling back at them. The killer smiled, stepped inside, and tried to make sure Anna Mae could not see they were hiding something behind their back. Then the killer looked Anna Mae right in the eye and said they were in trouble and that she was the only one who could help them. But Anna Mae did not want to hear it, and she said she did not want to help. So the killer started yelling at her and said she had to do what they were asking, but Anna Mae started backing away and told the killer to leave. So the killer screamed that they just needed help, but Anna Mae kept shouting right back that they just needed to leave. And the killer's head started pounding, and Anna Mae's voice was making the pain worse, so the killer finally pulled out the breaker bar from behind their back and held it over their head in a threatening manner. Anna Mae saw it and screamed and turned and started rushing across the living room. The killer tried to catch their breath and stop their head from pounding. Then they grabbed the braking bar tighter and chased after Anna Mae. The killer saw her go down the hall, fling open the basement door, and close it behind her. So the killer rushed down the hall, opened up the door again, and saw Anna Mae at the bottom of the basement stairs. But the killer moved fast and caught Anna Mae as she stepped onto the rug in front of the basement couch. And once they caught her, they slammed the braking bar into the back of Anna Mae's head, and Anna Mae's body crumpled onto the rug, and blood began to run down the back of her head. Then the killer tossed the braking bar to the floor and stood over Anna Mae. The killer couldn't believe Anna Mae had not been willing to just do what they had asked. The killer's whole body started shaking, and they clenched their teeth. Then, almost unconsciously, they reached down and unsheathed the bone-handled knife on their belt, and then they crouched down above Anna Mae. The killer grabbed her by the hair and slashed the knife across her throat. Then the killer raised the knife up and began screaming and driving the knife over and over and over again into Anna Mae's back. Even though Anna Mae wasn't moving, the killer didn't stop, over and over and over. Finally, the killer stood back up, and they looked down and saw blood all over their clothes and hands and arms. In their rage, they had stabbed Anna Mae 97 times. The killer walked slowly away from Anna Mae's body over to the washer and dryer. There, they stripped off their clothes, put them in the washer, and did a load of laundry. Then they walked into the basement bathroom, started the shower, stepped in, and washed all the blood off. And after the shower, the killer put their clothes into the dryer. Then they searched the basement until they found cleaning supplies and wiped off any drops of blood they had left behind in the bathroom and on the basement floor, walls, and staircase. The killer took their time and remained calm, and when they thought they had wiped the basement clean, they walked back over to the dryer, took their clothes out, and got dressed. But for some reason, once their clothes were back on, the reality of the situation hit them. They saw Anna Mae's body lying on the floor, and all of a sudden they panicked. So the killer grabbed their weapons, stumbled up the stairs, and made their way through the house. Then they opened the front door, squinted to try to see in the dark to make sure nobody was there, and then they ran outside. The killer climbed in their truck, started the engine, threw it in reverse, and peeled out into the street. And then they put the truck in drive and floored it across town until they got home. And at 9:15 p.m., 2 hours after the killer had gone to Anna Mae's house, the killer walked back into their own home and tried to act like nothing had happened and just sat down casually on the couch. Then the killer's wife walked into the room and told him that she and the kids had really enjoyed catching up with his aunt, Anna Mae, that night at church. And the killer said, "Me too." Russell Winstead, Anna Mae's nephew, the one who had come by and been so concerned about Robert Prince and his ghosts, had been the one who murdered his aunt, the woman he said was like a second mom to him. It would turn out the ledger that investigators found in Anna Mae's house showed that over the course of the past year, Russell had borrowed tens of thousands of dollars from Anna Mae. And that information had led police to investigate Russell's finances, but they didn't just discover that Russell was in significant debt to his aunt. They discovered he was leading a full-blown double life. Unknown to any of Russell's family, including his wife, he had a severe gambling addiction and was having an affair with a casino waitress. And from Russell's financial records and interviews with that waitress, investigators found out that Russell had visited casinos in Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois 236 times in the past year, and that he had been known to lose over $30,000 on some of those visits. And when Russell's gambling losses started to affect his family and his everyday life, he had turned to his rich aunt, Anna Mae, for help. But he had told her the money he needed to borrow from her was for mining equipment. But as Russell kept coming back for more and more money, Anna Mae figured out he was lying, and she confronted him. And he admitted to her that he had lost all the money she gave him gambling. But he begged Anna Mae to please just lend him a little bit more so he could cover his mortgage payment so he and his family wouldn't lose their house. And he promised Anna Mae that he would pay her back. And then on that Friday before the murder, when Russell came over to talk to Anna Mae and they began talking about Robert Prince and the ghosts, Russell had given Anna Mae a check for $12,000 to prove that he was on his way to paying her back in full. But it turned out that Russell didn't actually have the money to cover the check he had written her. Instead, he went to a casino that night to try to win that money, but he ended up losing thousands of dollars instead. And so, on the night of January 12th, Russell drove to church separately from his wife and kids. And after the service, they all said hello to Anna Mae and caught up with her. And then Russell's wife drove home with the kids, and Russell got into his own truck and began driving around town, wondering what he was going to do. He had his braking bar that he used in the mines in the truck with him, along with his knife on his belt. And so he came up with this plan where he would ask Anna Mae to give him back the $12,000 check he'd written so she couldn't deposit it. And if she didn't give the check to him, he would threaten her with the weapons to make her do it. But things had not gone according to that plan. And when Russell arrived at his aunt's house with his breaker behind his back and his knife on his hip and demanded his aunt give him back the check that he had written her, Anna Mae said no, and she told him she was going to tell Russell's wife about his gambling problem and about all the money she had loaned him that he had lost gambling. And when Russell heard that, he flew into a blind rage, and he chased Anna Mae down into the basement and attacked her so violently that the majority of the wounds she suffered were inflicted after she was already dead. It would take months for the investigation to compile all of their evidence against Russell. But in June of 2003, over 4 months after the murder, they were ready to arrest him. But when authorities moved in on Russell's house, they discovered he had fled the country to Costa Rica, and they learned that Russell's father, Earl, was sending money he had inherited from his sister, Anna Mae, the woman Russell had murdered, to financially support Russell in Costa Rica. But with the assistance of Costa Rican authorities, U.S. federal agents were able to track Russell down, and he was arrested in Costa Rica, walking out of a casino. Russell was extradited to the United States, convicted of murder, and given 2 sentences of 25 years to life with a chance for parole in 2049. Earl would plead guilty to hindering apprehension, and he was given 2 years of probation. Anna Mae Branson is buried in Kentucky, and her family and members of the community still visit her grave often over 20 years after her death. On a hot fall morning in 1998, a 57-year-old cabinet maker named Kiam Bing stood outside of his shop in a rural Malaysian village, waiting for a friend to pick up an order. Kiam Bing swatted away mosquitoes and looked down the road. His friend, Ash, was an hour late. He had promised to be there when the shop opened, but there was still no sign of him. In front of his workshop, Kiam Bing could see an orchard that grew durian, which is a popular fruit in Southeast Asia. Next to the orchard, another farm raised hundreds of pigs. Their familiar grunting echoed through the dense canopy of trees. Nearly everyone in town made a living as farmers, and Kiam Bing could smell the earthy aroma of freshly tilled soil and manure in the humid air. Kiam Bing eyed the empty road again and turned back to his shop. He didn't have a phone, otherwise he would have called to see where Ash was. But until Ash showed up, Kiam Bing was content to go back to his work while his dogs ran in and out of the workshop. But as the hours ticked by, Kiam Bing started to think that his friend might not come to pick up his cabinets at all. Finally, as Kiam Bing prepared to close up at the end of the day, a messenger arrived with a note from Ash. He had a headache and he was vomiting, so he wasn't able to go anywhere. Kiam Bing thanked the messenger and then finished closing up his shop and then started walking home with his dogs. The sun was setting over the lush green valley, and he could just barely see bats fluttering in the durian trees. Kiam Bing was worried about his sick friend. The symptoms he listed were painfully familiar. There was a serious illness going around this town that the local doctors called Japanese encephalitis. Other people had become so sick that they couldn't move or speak, and still others had seizures and went into comas. Kiam Bing prayed that Ash wouldn't be one of the unlucky ones. As Kiam Bing kept walking down the road, he saw a giant truck slowly drive by that was billowing white fog into the air behind it. Kiam Bing had read that the Malaysian government was spraying the area to kill mosquitoes, which was how Japanese encephalitis was spread. The sight of the truck made Kiam Bing feel a little more at ease. Once the mosquitoes were gone, the disease would go away too. The next day, Kiam Bing spent the morning painting cabinets and playing fetch with his 2 dogs. Later in the afternoon, he heard a car rumbling down the road, and he looked up hopefully. The road wasn't usually very busy, and he'd checked every car that passed to see if it was Ash. But as this car got closer, he could see that it was the same messenger from the day before. The messenger pulled up and then got out of the car and walked up to Kiam Bing's shop. His expression was grim as he handed Kiam Bing the paper with the message. This time, it was written by Ash's wife. Kiam Bing's heart sank as he read. Ash had been taken to the hospital, but he was too sick, and the doctors there couldn't help him. He had died from this Japanese encephalitis. Kiam Bing felt a sense of dread. He'd known how dangerous the disease was, but now that his friend was dead, it felt much more real. He hurried back to his shop and called his dogs inside. Then he closed the door. Kiam Bing realized that he hadn't been taking the disease seriously enough. Now he was determined to do whatever was necessary to avoid being bit by a mosquito, even if that meant staying inside basically all the time and shutting down his business for a while. The government was spraying pesticides to kill all the mosquitoes, but Kiam Bing knew the insects would not disappear completely. Several months later, on February 27, 1999, a young scientist named Ka Bing Chua steadied his hands as he swabbed a viral culture onto a petri dish. Dr. Chua was studying virology at the University of Malaya Medical Center in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia's largest city. Dr. Chua was investigating the outbreak of a disease that the government had been calling Japanese encephalitis. Roughly 200 people in Malaysia had gotten sick so far, and close to 100 had been admitted to Dr. Chua's hospital. Most of them exhibited the same symptoms: swelling of the brain, which led to an inability to talk or walk. Many of the patients became fully paralyzed or fell into comas. The fatality rate was staggering. 2 out of every 5 people who became infected died, making the outbreak almost as lethal as the bubonic plague, which wiped out a third of Europe's entire population during the Middle Ages. Dr. Chua's university had conducted a variety of tests to confirm that all the sick patients were positive for Japanese encephalitis. However, the results of these tests were inconclusive. There were at least a few researchers who felt they couldn't be exactly sure what was making all these people sick. However, the symptoms were highly similar to Japanese encephalitis, and there were no other known diseases in the area that could explain the outbreak. But Dr. Chua was uncomfortable settling on this sort of uncertain evidence. He had a nagging feeling that there was something else going on. Dr. Chua was also getting mounting pressure from his lab director to come up with better answers soon. Right now, the government was investing all its efforts in killing mosquitoes. But what if this outbreak wasn't being spread by mosquitoes after all? One of Dr. Chua's colleagues, who had been studying the question of which people were most likely to get sick, had pointed out an interesting fact. No Muslims had been infected with this virus, even though Islam is Malaysia's leading religion. This was strange because Japanese encephalitis is transmitted through mosquito bites, and there was no reason why people of a particular religion would be immune to mosquitoes. This made Dr. Chua even more skeptical that the patients they were studying had Japanese encephalitis. So he decided to run his own tests. He was going to isolate the disease right there in his lab so he could get a better look at it. Dr. Chua hand-selected cerebrospinal fluid and serum samples from patients whose symptoms most closely resembled Japanese encephalitis. Then he put each one in a sealed dish and tucked it into an incubator that warmed it to the temperature of a human body, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Then Chua waited. He hoped that the warmed-up fluid samples would create the perfect environment for the disease to show itself. If successful, Dr. Chua would eventually be able to cultivate highly concentrated and highly lethal dishes full of the disease that he could study. Nearly 1 week later, Dr. Chua pulled the cultures from the incubator. While the samples had been incubating, 5 more patients had been admitted to a nearby hospital with the same deadly symptoms. Their fluid samples were sent to Dr. Chua's department. Dr. Chua knew that every second counted. If this disease was not Japanese encephalitis, and Dr. Chua was able to identify what it really was, then doctors might be able to find a cure and save everyone who was already sick. Dr. Chua slid the samples under his microscope and then stooped down to look through the eyepiece. His experiment with the incubator had worked. The dish was jammed full of invading microbes. But when this virus was exposed to animal cells, the nature of its deadly effect was unexpected. Dr. Chua wasn't sure what he was looking at, but it definitely was not Japanese encephalitis. Dr. Chua knew he needed to show his boss, who was the head of the department at the university, right away, and so Dr. Chua sprinted out the door to find him. 20 minutes later, Dr. Chua's boss was examining the same culture under the microscope. Dr. Chua stood nearby, his stomach churning with anxiety. He knew his finding was significant, and they could save lives if they acted fast. But after a long moment, Dr. Chua's boss finally stood and just shook his head. He interpreted the results differently and didn't see enough evidence to prove that the virus was new. He argued that the virus's strange behavior could be due to normal variations in the culture, or even that the culture could be contaminated. He still believed that the results were consistent with this being Japanese encephalitis. He told Dr. Chua to throw the sample away. Dr. Chua was shocked. He knew that his experiment was not contaminated, but he also knew better than to outright challenge his superior. However, Dr. Chua knew he could not back down completely. There was too much at stake. He just needed to find the right moment to convince his boss. 4 days later, on March 9th, Dr. Chua got his chance. He was driving with his boss and 2 other colleagues returning from a meeting. The rain was coming down in sheets, and their car was inching forward in heavy traffic. It gave Dr. Chua a captive audience. Dr. Chua glanced at the men and then leaned forward in his seat, making sure he had his boss's attention. Dr. Chua cleared his throat and then quickly launched into his theory. He emphasized the virus's unique effect on animal cells and said the variation was enough to prove that they were dealing with something unknown. The disease they were fighting was caused by an entirely new virus, he said, and they needed to take action immediately. The sickness had already spread to several other Malaysian states and hopped the border into Singapore. As Dr. Chua described his findings, his colleagues' expressions showed signs of concern, but Dr. Chua's boss remained neutral. He pressed on, explaining that while he was sure they had discovered a new virus, their lab's equipment was not yet powerful enough to identify it. He argued that they really needed to send the cultures to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States. The CDC had the right equipment, and it was in their best interest to help. This wasn't simply an outbreak affecting people in Malaysia. It had the potential to become a global pandemic with devastating consequences if they didn't control it quickly. The air in the car was thick with tension as Dr. Chua waited for his boss to react. Finally, his boss cleared his throat and spoke. Dr. Chua's theory had merit, he said, and he would think about it overnight. Then the car they were in pulled up to Dr. Chua's boss's home, and his boss climbed out and walked away in the pouring rain. The next morning, Dr. Chua woke up to the sound of his phone ringing. It was his boss. He told Dr. Chua that he'd made some calls and a travel visa was being expedited for Dr. Chua to get to the United States. Dr. Chua was so relieved, and he thanked his boss, and then he rushed to the hospital to prepare the virus samples for a trip to America. Four days later, Dr. Chua stood in the CDC's research lab in Fort Collins, Colorado. Dr. Chua peered through a powerful electron microscope at his slides. This awesome device was literally thousands of times better than anything Dr. Chua was using at magnifying samples, giving Chua a much more intimate look at his adversary. Underneath the lens of the microscope, his virus cultures revealed tiny ring-like formations covering the slide. He blinked and looked again to make sure. Now, Dr. Chua knew for certain that the scientists in Malaysia had misidentified the virus. But Dr. Chua did not feel excitement or pride that he had been right. Instead, at that moment, he felt terror. The type of virus on that slide was far deadlier than Japanese encephalitis, and it wasn't spread by mosquitoes. But, based on the virus's unique characteristics, Dr. Chua was almost positive he knew what was spreading it. He needed to report his findings immediately. Dr. Chua flagged down one of the CDC's scientists and asked for the nearest telephone. After he finished his call to his boss in Malaysia, he showed his discovery to CDC officials. They were instantly alarmed and agreed with Dr. Chua's assessment. The outbreak in Malaysia had the potential to kill millions of people. Back in Malaysia, a few days after Dr. Chua's discovery, the 57-year-old cabinet maker, Kiam Bing, watched from the doorway of his workshop as soldiers put up barricades at the end of the main road in his town. Kiam Bing was staying inside as much as possible to avoid the mosquitoes that he believed were carrying this virus. The only time he went outside was to run between his home and his shop. By now, it seemed like almost every family in town had lost a loved one to this terrible disease. They'd all died painful and horrifying deaths, and residents were in a panic. The disease was showing no signs of slowing down either, and so the government was barricading the road into town to keep residents there quarantined. Kiam Bing had lived here his entire life, and he couldn't remember any other time when travel in or out of the area had been restricted. The road was usually bustling with people going to and from work at this time of the day, but now it was deserted. The only sound was the fluttering of these red banners that people hung outside of their houses to ward off death. The silence frightened Kiam Bing. Even his dogs seemed different. Instead of jumping around and playing with their ball, they curled up quietly on the floor. And then, as Kiam Bing was watching all this strangeness unfold in front of him, Kiam Bing began to hear the sound of gunshots. When Kiam Bing heard these gunshots, he instinctively hid behind his counter. Once it stopped, Kiam Bing stood up and slowly opened his front door to see what was going on outside. And what he saw was a group of soldiers with rifles slung across their backs, marching out from behind a farm down the road and heading towards the next one. Also, there were all these military vehicles full of dozens more soldiers that were driving down the road, and they were all heading for different farms. Kiam Bing watched as some of the soldiers stopped in front of the farm right across the street, and they went around to the back of the property. Kiam Bing stepped out of his store to get a better look, and he peered around the corner of the farm across the street, and he could see the soldiers now pointing their rifles towards the trees, and also the pig pens below the trees. Kiam Bing knew what was coming next, and he couldn't bear to watch it. He ran back to the doorway of his shop, and then a few moments later, he heard more gunfire and the terrible sound of pigs squealing in agony. Kiam Bing could literally smell the coppery stench of blood as it wafted through the thick, hot air. And then moments later, the soldiers emerged from behind the farm and began marching down the street towards the next farm. And the farm's owner from across the street followed the soldiers out onto the road, and the owner just sat down on the sidewalk and put his face in his hands. Once the soldiers had marched down the road and were gone, Kiam Bing hustled across the street and knelt down next to the farmer who still had his face in his hands. After making sure this farmer was okay, Kiam Bing gently asked, what happened? What's going on? And the farmer just shook his head in disbelief, and in a shaky voice, he told Kiam Bing that the government had issued an order for all the pigs in this village to be slaughtered and buried. They told him that this would stop the terrible disease that had been killing people for months. Kiam Bing was shocked. He remembered that the government had sprayed the town for the mosquitoes to stop the disease. Now they were saying it came from the pigs? Kiam Bing returned to his shop and closed the door. He smiled at his dogs, who hadn't moved since he left. Kiam Bing felt badly for his neighbors, but at the same time, he was grateful that the mystery of this disease seemed to be solved, and that now Kiam Bing really was safe. It was nearly impossible to avoid all mosquitoes like Kiam Bing had been trying to do, but he had no reason to interact with pigs, which apparently were the reason this disease was spreading, and so Kiam Bing really felt like he was going to be okay. 2 days later, Kiam Bing woke up feeling feverish. His head was pounding and he couldn't pull himself from the bed. His skin felt like it was on fire. In a panic, he realized that he must be sick with this mysterious disease. Kiam Bing didn't understand how this was happening to him. He hadn't gone near any pigs. But Kiam Bing didn't have time to worry about that. He needed to get to a hospital. He managed to drag himself out of bed and stumbled over to a neighbor's house where he knew there was a phone. He begged the neighbor to please call him an ambulance, and then Kiam Bing collapsed to the ground. A few minutes later, the paramedics arrived and took Kiam Bing to the nearest major hospital, which was about 50 miles to the north, at the University Hospital in Kuala Lumpur. The intake nurse in the emergency room asked Kiam Bing to describe his symptoms and when they started, and Kiam Bing, who had been strapped to a gurney for the entire ambulance ride, felt his voice stick in his throat. To his horror, he couldn't respond. He tried to swallow, but it was no use. He was totally paralyzed. Kiam Bing could see the nurse's eyes widen in alarm. He watched, terrified, as the nurses wheeled him through the hospital, helpless as he felt his body lock around him. It didn't take long to confirm that Kiam Bing's sickness was indeed the same virus that Dr. Chua had identified in Colorado at the CDC research lab. But that knowledge didn't help Kiam Bing's doctors. Shortly after he was admitted, Kiam Bing fell into a vegetative state and then died. In early June of 1999, around 3 months after Kiam Bing died, Dr. Chua was back at his office in Kuala Lumpur. It seemed like the mystery virus had been defeated, all thanks to Dr. Chua's quick thinking. But Dr. Chua wasn't sure if the mystery really was completely solved. The virus he had identified at the CDC's lab was called a paramyxovirus. This virus is transmitted from livestock animals to people, and many of the patients who had caught it worked with pigs. It wasn't affecting Muslims because they didn't eat pork. But many people in the country did eat pork, So Dr. Chua and a team of experts had advised the Malaysian authorities that if they wanted to stop the disease, they would have to make the difficult decision to kill as many pigs as possible in the affected areas. The government reacted quickly and sent squads of soldiers to eliminate over 1 million pigs. And after they did that, sure enough, cases of this mysterious disease started to dwindle. When it came to naming the virus, officials looked to the small pig farming town it had originated in and where Kiam Bing, the cabinet maker, was from, Nipah. They would call it the Nipah virus. But something kept bothering Dr. Chua. Most of the Nipah virus victims were farmers who had direct contact with infected pigs, which made sense. But nearly 20% of the patients had minimal or no contact with the animals, but they still got this disease. Kiam Bing, the cabinet maker, was one of those unlucky 20%. Dr. Chua knew that Kiam Bing must have caught this disease somewhere, and if it wasn't from pigs, then where did he get it from? Could it be that another animal was spreading the Nipah virus in addition to the pigs? Chua started to wonder if pigs really were the source of the virus or if they were just a carrier. Maybe, he thought, the true source of the virus was another creature altogether. And so now that the outbreak was under control following the elimination of all these pigs, the Malaysian government deployed a team of researchers to try to determine the true source of the Nipah virus. As the scientists investigated, they found that the Nipah virus was closely related to another virus that had caused a small outbreak in Australia a few years earlier. At the time, researchers had been able to identify the source of the outbreak. It was fruit bats. So now, Malaysian researchers quickly zeroed in on an extraordinary type of bat called the flying fox, which lived near the village of Nipah and throughout the country. These animals, among the largest bats in the world, can have wingspans of up to 5 feet, but they're not normally harmful to humans. They mostly mind their own business, feeding on fruit trees like durian, which was one of the primary crops grown in Nipah. But when researchers captured some flying foxes for study, they found that a large number of them tested positive for Nipah virus. The virus did not seem to harm the animals at all, but the researchers suddenly realized that the bats themselves were doing enormous harm to the people all around them. The bats, not the pigs and not the mosquitoes, were the real source of this terrible disease. Here's how it worked. The bats came out at night to feed on the durian flowers, and as they did that, their droppings and urine would fall to the ground below them. When morning came, the pigs were let out of their pens, and they came into contact with the bat droppings and the bat urine that was contaminated with the Nipah virus. And so did other animals, like horses and dogs, and in turn, these animals passed it on to their owners. That's how people who did not work with pigs became infected, and that's how Kiam Bing, the cabinet maker, got the virus. At some point, his dogs must have sniffed around some durian trees and come into contact with infected droppings, and then when Kiam Bing went to play with them and the dogs licked his face, they passed the virus on to him. In the past, there had never been a Nipah virus outbreak because fruit trees like durian and the bats were far from any industrial animal farms. But as farming expanded in Malaysia, fruit orchards were planted right next to pig farms and other commercial areas, which allowed the disease to spread. The discovery that fruit bats were the real spreader of the virus allowed the researchers to truly understand how the Nipah virus operated. But it also meant that future outbreaks would be impossible to stop. The fruit bats responsible for the Nipah virus live throughout Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. There's no way to effectively control their population or to stop them from eating fruit from commercial farms. So the only way to truly stop the Nipah virus is to create a vaccine for it. But scientists haven't figured out how to make one yet. In recent years, there have been more outbreaks around the world, striking fear into scientists and public health officials. The World Health Organization has labeled this virus as being a virus with catastrophic global pandemic potential. If the virus ever becomes airborne, it could be transmitted through coughs, sneezes, or contaminated surfaces. If that happens, millions of lives will be at risk. And we might not be able to do anything about it. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Kinsey Clark. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Tasia Palaconda. Fact-checking was done by Bennett Logan. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zaire. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Laura Donna Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Moore.